from the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt. He took an army of archaeologists, epigraphers with him, and all that material was made available. In addition, what isn't clear from the French original is now, in his footnotes, is that he also made use of, and clearly had access to, a good many 16th and 17th century editions of medieval and earlier Christian mystics and philosophers, whose works he quarried to put in the symbolism from that source, some of which goes back to the classical world anyway. So he had a wide range of things, but almost all of it falls into two halves. The first half is the Egyptian symbolism, which he was most keen on, and to a certain extent classical. The second half was the Christian interpretation of that symbolism.
No, there's a third half, at least 55% worth, which is his interest in the Near East, which didn't include the Egyptian. And Bob, you have to give him the grace, the benefit of acknowledging that he was himself a mystic belonging to a school. That is very clear. His whole thought process is a joined up synthesis. It's not derived and blended, like as perhaps a historian of that time might have pulled together. Yeah, his work is beautifully synthesized. Yeah, and that to me speaks more of a tradition in him than of a study. So, we have to consider that too.
Well, I think you could say, if I can come back, it is not so much a sort of academic hand as an essay on colour symbolism for the use of people, whether they be architects, which is translations. Inman was doing it for architects who wanted to use colour symbolism in a sort of expanding Gothic architecture that went with a sort of church revival in this country. But what Portal was doing was providing something for people who were themselves interested in colour symbolism for their own spiritual pursuits. It doesn't matter where he got it from in that sense. What it is a valuable resource for just that thing. I think.
Absolutely, and it's correct, and that he did produce the book for architects. It was produced for an architect's journal, and in that sense he was reaching out to architects.
Yeah. The translation was.
Correct.
The original one was written for a wide audience.
Yes. Yeah, but at the same time he was writing for the mystic at heart. His work just speaks of it. It just is drooling with it. And I don't know what else to say except buy the book.
And more important, read it.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, do people buy books and not read them?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Do you believe it? Okay.
Maybe could you just go over quickly who the 5 alchemists were and just give us a tiny bit of information about each one?
I'm going to read to you,
Sure.
because otherwise I'll make mistakes, which is quite common in my life. Roger Bacon, he was a 13th century alchemist. Sir George Ripley, he was a 15th century alchemist. Thomas Norton, he was a 16th century. In fact, he bordered both the 15th and 16th. Thomas Charnock, from his period was really 16th century. And William Backhouse, who was 17th century in the main. He was born in, by all accounts, in 1593. Now, there are many, many references and legends about this. When I lived in Bristol, which I did for many years, I was introduced to St Mary's Redcliffe, which is a fabulous church started to build in the 12th century, if I remember rightly, but it was really developed in the 15th century and developed with the assistance of Thomas Norton. Well, that's a matter of fact, but what was the interesting thing is, quite some years ago, I was in the neighbourhood and I realised that they were doing an archaeological dig, and they came across his patron's house, and they got down to a level which they thought were kitchens, but there were 7 great ovens, and the floor was covered with pigments of all kinds, and they came to realise that this was where the stained glass came from. And there was making of stained glass, which in itself was an alchemical process, or at least treated with the secrecy of alchemy. So Norton is really interesting in terms of Bristol life, and Bristol was a very important seaport, and almost at one point became the capital of Britain. Didn't know that, capital of England, I should say. So Thomas Norton, very interesting. Ripley and the Ripley Scrolls. Well, what you need to do is read the book. And you see, because I can only give you a very bad introduction to these chaps. Were that Bob was here, but Bob, what? Oh, Bob Black, Dr. Robert Black. If he was here, he could tell you a lot more. But he is nursing a sick member of family, so he can't make it.